Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Well, for the first time in 2 decades, Afghanistan is not at war, so I suppose that's a positive thing for the people of Afghanistan. However, they are ruled over by a group of Islamists who were the insurgents for 20 years and who bloodied the country significantly in that time. If it's true they have a constituency amongst part of the population, they don't amongst a significant tranche of the rest of the population. And they're far from being a democratic body. The country at the moment hangs in limbo, and in between its past and its future. At the moment, it's entirely isolated, with the exception of diplomatic recognition from Putin's Russia 1 month ago. It's cut off from the rest of the world. Half of the population requires food aid to survive. Our government, the U.S. government, has cut off most humanitarian aid, so we'll see whether it's going to be contributing to that or not, usually provided by the UN. In addition to being one of the world's poorest countries, it's also now, and in the grip of the Taliban, who have a group which has, as we know, severely suppressed the rights of women, particularly. It is also facing the deluge from returning refugees, Afghans, as many as 5 million, en route to the country from either Iran or Pakistan, where they've been refugees in some cases for their whole lives. They're being forced out back into the country, into this kind of poor, hopefully not too toxic mix. Again, back to what I said at the beginning, it's no longer at war. It does have terrorist groups that attack targets inside Afghanistan that are sort of the Taliban's own Frankenstein, spin-offs from their most militant days, even more radically Islamist than the Taliban, who typically attack Shiites, who they see as apostates, and girls' schools. So there you go. Not the best, not the happiest of pictures, but there are worse places in the world, I guess. I think, most right-minded people in the world agreed with the initial action taken by the U.S. in retaliation for those horrific terrorist attacks. I think, and what happened then was that the Taliban, who had given sanctuary to Al-Qaeda and a group and a whole panoply of terrorists from across the Islamic world, defied the request to hand him over, so a war began. It involved, B-52 bombing against military targets by the American forces, and sort of rent-a-mob tactics where mostly our intelligence agents, went in and hired warlords who would fight against the Taliban and field men in battle against them. And they vanished into the hinterland. I call the Taliban's disappearance in the fall of 2001 more a tactical retreat than a defeat. And indeed, within 3 years, they were resurging around the country, and did progressively so, despite the many troops that were poured into the country, the surges, the expansion of the U.S. presence and its allies into a NATO force, a NATO effort. They continued to progress and advance until 2021, when they took the country back. So, in answer to your question, I don't see there was anything wrong with the initial invasion, to call it that, or police action. I think what happened after that was that I think the thinking got muddle-headed, and the objectives became something that were fought over, just as they were fought over in the United States, because we have a spectrum of opinion, about what we should and shouldn't do anywhere at any time. That I think that was reflected in the way we behaved in Afghanistan. As the program, our program there and our objectives there morphed and transmuted. We also went away for a while, took our took our eye off the 8 ball and invaded Iraq, which was itself a fairly dismal exercise, but never left Afghanistan, and until 4 years ago, when the Taliban took it back. Look, I think that there's a tendency by people who have strong opinions or maybe sit away from the fray to try to find black and white reasons why things fail or succeed, usually fail. I remember there was a certain portion of the American body politic that blamed the defeat in Vietnam on the Pinko Congress, and for that matter, journalists, because they didn't support the war. Well, that's a pretty hollow argument. And as it is to blame, say, the liberals' introduction of gender studies into Afghanistan as the reason why the Taliban resurged, that's frankly bullshit. Did it tick off old, bearded mullahs in the hinterland who had previously held sway over populations and felt that they were losing their authority and felt displaced by outsiders and these ideas that they'd always fought against? Yeah. Did it remind some of them of the way the Soviets had behaved when they came in and tried to communize the country, forcing, ripping women's burqas off in the countryside and shaving men's beards, humiliating them in public? Yeah, there was cultural clumsiness on the part of the Americans, but by and large, we were not a bully boy force by and large, and took soundings along the way. I think it, what happened is the sum of a lot of things, decisions taken for conjunctural reasons, for tactical reasons, for political reasons, alliances that were unholy in some cases, but which served at that moment to help pacify part of the country or its clans. This is a very difficult place to operate in, made up of people who speak different languages, who have a millennia-long history of warring between clans and sects, with uneasy borders. So to insert ourselves into that, I think, like you recalled the Bonn conference, the war was still underway. The Taliban hadn't been routed. And there you had, the good-minded people of the world gathering in a foreign capital to decide who they might find who would be acceptable to a majority of Afghans that could help provide a figurehead. It was not a bad idea. Karzai was not a bad idea. He was not a bad choice. He came from the majority Pashtun Popolzai clan, which was directly linked to the monarchy that had been displaced by the communists in the 70s. Which notionally had held the country, given it some kind of social glue, by and large, through the 19th and 20th, much of the 20th centuries, and he had no real enemies. He'd been in one of the Mujahideen groups against the Soviets, but been a kind of technocrat, a public relations guy, was seen as educated, not violent, didn't have a violent past, had a lot going for him. And the idea of a loya jirga, this kind of grand assembly that the Afghans are used to, where all the elders and the men of influence from the various sects and regions and tribes come together to support or argue against a kind of political decisions made by their figurehead. So in that sense, I think Karzai worked. There were Tajiks, the people in the north, who had traditionally been, feuding with the Pashtuns, and with, for that matter, the Taliban was a Pashtun force, who signed on as well. He created under Western direction somewhat. He created a fairly representative cabinet. There were the inevitable bad choices. It was a bit green in some cases. There were, as with any new government, there were people that had to go, others that had to be brought in. Not everybody was honest. And then so here's where my criticism really begins of our presence and our role there. And it's that I felt that we didn't invest him with enough sovereign power. Seeing that he was pretty much a Western puppet, and that's certainly what his enemies, the Taliban, believed him to be, and the naysayers of that project, he struggled to overcome that tag. He was arguably a puppet, and yet our rhetoric, whether it was during the Bush administration or the Obama, was to boost her, it was to champion him and boost him. It became increasingly like a sour marriage. You may remember that. And at the root of it, I felt, because I got to know him a fair bit while he was president, was that he felt like a cuckolded wife. He didn't have real power. He would hold these great jirgas or assemblies and make all kinds of promises, which, it was his right and duty to do as the president of the country, and then he wouldn't follow through. And I remember trying to follow up some of these promises with him and going to the Americans and saying, well, are you going to back him up for that promise? A health clinic in a region that was devastated, whatever. No, they didn't. They didn't. And once and again, he was shown to be, a paper, whatever the metaphor is, a man of straw, a straw man. And that was, I think, humiliating to him. And we also had kind of double role in the country as the war got intensified. We had our armies there. Yes, you could see them. They had embedded reporters with them and all the rest of it. These were good lads from wherever they came from, right? Mostly, and young women too. But we also had a paramilitary force. We had a lot of contractors who were there not necessarily out of patriotic or, noblesse oblige, patriotic motivations, but money. That's what contractors do, right? We don't call them mercenaries anymore. They're contractors. But effectively, those who are fighting, and we also had a secret army. Our intelligence agency ran a secret army of up to 3,000 men at one point, and they did all kinds of things that our army boys were not allowed to do, or were told they shouldn't do, and which were publicized, and in some cases, transgressions that caused problems. But so the Afghans knew all along that there was this double face of the Western presence, which also played into the Taliban's hands and their own propaganda. If you come in with a universalist or an absolutist, better said, an absolutist kind of, we're the good guys, we're going to help you. The operation was called, I think, Enduring Freedom. Really? Yeah. When you're that absolutist about what you're offering a country, you better bloody well fulfill it. These are people that were cut off from the outside world and have only known bloodshed for the previous 20 years, more. And they were, we were the city on the hill. Look, it's a big discussion, and one that I feel that it hasn't really taken place, which is the degree to which, and I'm no expert here, but I do know that there's been a huge change in the way the American military works. Let's say since the days of even Clinton, or certainly since Vietnam, where you have a huge aspects of our military juggernaut, our construct is privatized. So as in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had vast numbers of people. I was shocked to read them myself, even though I covered intensively both conflicts. I don't know, at one point there might have been, let's just say, 50,000 identifiable NATO troops and, 80,000 contractors who somehow were opaque, off in the shadows. Like, who were they? What did they do? Well, you'd meet them if you went on an embed or you went to a base. There'd be ties, or, there might be former American military guys who were, retired, and rather than be a security guard at the nearest Costco, they could earn $100,000 doing something in logistics or even fighting in Afghanistan, fulfilling some role. You can't fault those guys for doing that. And they were earning 5 or 6 times what the enlisted men were earning. But as the wars progressed, the sheer amount of money that went to these firms that were the contracted firms, whether they were providing water or sewage services or anything, or some of the intel. I went on an anti-Taliban opium mission in 2007, and if I'm not mistaken, the administration decided that the heroin production was way too high, so they were going to now, 6 years into the war, stop it. And they gave a $10 or $12 billion contract to DynCorp, which, it's 95% of its proceeds come from the Pentagon, but it's supposedly it's a parastatal, right? So, Kellogg, Brown and Root, they would charge for every paper plate that they handed out. If you went to the mess tent in your forward operating base, they charged $60 for that. If you got another paper plate to put on top of it to keep the dust off, that was $120. They had a regular rotation for a contract that allowed them $100 every 3 days, I think it was. It might have been 1 day a week. So if I'm exaggerating slightly, forgive me. But it's either once or twice a week. Whether or not you did launder your uniform, they were the launderers, and they charged $100 per uniform for it. Bottles of water were flown into Afghanistan from Dubai. Early in the war, there was we never built a water processing plant for the Afghans. No, we did a deal with someone in Dubai, a desert country, who was already had some, those plastic water bottles, and we flew them in. Water flown in from one desert country to another, where they were handed out to American troops. And by the time the American troops drank them and threw them into onto the wasteland, they were costing $12 a piece. That was money coming out of our pockets, right? Mostly the Afghans didn't see the benefits of the American economic presence. Those who were hired to do menial tasks or as interpreters or whatever, yes, you formed a kind of new middle and mercantile class, mostly in the cities, mostly in the capital, actually, not the rest of the country. But it didn't really trickle down to most of the rest. I may have gotten off the tack there, but yes, I mean, the kind of scoundrels who pitched up in Afghanistan, and Iraq, for that matter, who got jobs just because they were there. It's pretty amazing. I met a guy once, just to give you an idea, briefly. They even contracted out functions of the U.S. Embassy after spending $600 million on a RPG-proof bunker in the middle of Kabul, everybody lived in trailers and went into that bunker in a tunnel in the middle of the city. The biggest building in Kabul, the only one we really ever built, was our bunker. Now, no doubt, some Taliban headquarters. I went to see the ambassador once, and the guy that sat in with me wasn't a State Department PAO. He was some dude from San Diego. Nice guy, but he worked for some Beltway outfit, and he was making a good $300,000 to $400,000 a year. He told me he was a surfer dude. He smoked dope. He used to be a roadie for Janis Joplin, but he was a good friend of Donald Rumsfeld, and that's how he got his job. And he hung out with General Dostum, by the way. Yeah, he had a swimming pool at his villa, and Dostum would bring, Russian prostitutes, and they would have just a hunky-dory time there in that swimming pool. That was Kabul. I do fault President Trump 1.0 for opening the door to the Taliban. He's the one who did what you do. What you don't do. I'm not a poker player, but I assume that when you go and you sit down at the table, you don't show the other players that you have an ace in your sleeve, right? You don't do that. The ace in the sleeve to the American president presence, or for that matter, any occupying military presence in another country at war, is you don't tell your enemies when you're going to leave or that you want to leave. You've just given them a priceless piece of information. To an insurgent force that's happy to live close to the ground and used to living close to the ground and fighting, like the ant against the elephant. The minute they hear that, they know it's theirs. They can wait another few years, and they did. So, yeah, it happened under Biden's, under Biden's watch. Therefore, he owns it in our political, in our political world. That means he owns it. But the guy who opened the door was Trump, and he did so because he clearly doesn't understand the rules of the game. Just as we're seeing now, we don't need a ceasefire to have peace talks. Really, sorry. If he'd ever read anything more than a comic book in his life, maybe we wouldn't have some of these situations we've had. I believe that, look, it wasn't just Trump who came along and withheld aid. There was other moments when aid was withheld, where hands were slapped, where guys in this or that role were pushed out because they were seen as corrupt or inconvenient and given different jobs in the course of the run-up to Trump 1.0. But if you're the president of a country and it's your national prestige that's at stake, you must do everything you can vis-a-vis your other more powerful enemies to vouchsafe that prestige. That prestige was squandered.